Hello, this is Stuart Bray, back with another video, this time looking at fiberglassing. Now I've been making a plaster head that I'm going to be using for a makeup, and now that I've got my head all cleaned up and ready to go, I need to make what's known as a master mould so that I can reproduce this in different materials for sculpting and moulding other pieces. So let's head over to the mould room and take a look at the fiberglassing step of the mould making. Okay, the first thing I'm going to do is cut up some slices of clay using this clay cutter I've got here, which is basically just like a strip of plastic that has some wire stretched across it, and that is going to be used, like I say, to slice the clay into even thicknesses. So I put a board onto the clay and drag the clay slicer across it, and it basically means I can consistently cut even thicknesses of clay. And what I'm going to do is cut these into little slices and use these onto the head just to kind of make a wall that will separate the back and the front halves. So the reason I like to use these thin slices here is that I can then bend them around corners more easily. And I'm going to go over the top of the head and round the ears and sort of just slightly past the halfway point so that this back half will come off nice and easily. I'm going to do this back half in pure fiberglass. I'm going to use silicone on the front, but I'm going to use just fiberglass on the back because there's no detail on the back really, it's just a smooth shape. So if I just use fiberglass to the mold on the back half, I've got all that detail. I just need to make sure that I can get it off this head. So the easiest way to do that is to make sure I creep back slightly past the halfway point so that the back half should release nice and easily. I want to try and build the wall up about 2.5 inches, something like that, so that I've got a decent height wall all the way around. And like I said, I'm avoiding the ears on this. I'm going around the back of the ears with the clay wall because I'm going to include the ears in the front half of the mould, which is going to be silicone, because obviously there's a lot of detail in the ears, so it makes sense to include those in the silicone half. Once I've got the clay in place and I'm happy with the height of the wall, I'm going to cover the whole front of the face with tissue paper, and I'm going to wet that down with a damp sponge. And the idea of this tissue paper is just to protect the face so that I can build up a plaster bandage wall, and I don't want to get any mess or any bits of plaster or fiberglass drizzled on the plaster face itself. So this is just a very easy way to protect the face, and also being just tissue, it just peels off very easily as well, and you can kind of dab it on, like I say, with a sponge, and it just kind of conforms to all the shapes of the face nicely, so it sits there and like when it's done, you just peel it off. So I'm going to use some plaster bandage. I'm using maybe 2 or 3 layers of plaster bandage folded over into a short section, and basically I'm putting the plaster bandage onto the back of the plaster wall, and this is going to support to the clay so that when I'm working on it from the other side it doesn't move, because I'm going to be sort of neatening it up with tools on the other side and fiberglassing it, so it's going to get a lot of sort of pounding, and we want to make sure that clay wall stays fast the whole way through the job. After about 10 minutes that plaster bandage is set up, and I can start to neaten up the walls, and I'm going to use little smooth tools. I've got these little steel tools, or you can use wooden tools, any kind of sculpting tools you have, just something that's flat and you can use to kind of smooth out the clay. And basically what I'm going to do is join up the little sections of clay here. They're held in place, but they just need to be smoothed out so that it's just one smooth wall. So I just take my time, go around the edges, fill any holes, smooth out any lumps, and just make the whole thing nice and neat, and make sure it sits square on the edge of the plaster and goes right down to the board as well, so we've got a nice neat clean wall. And everything that I do here is going to get picked up by the fiberglass, so the neater and smoother you make it, the better your mold's going to be, and the easier it is to clean up later. Now that the wall's all nice and smooth, I'm just going to put a little groove, like a little channel, all the way around the head, very close to the plaster, keeping back about 1/4 inch, 6 or 7 millimeters away from that plaster, just to create a key that's going to be on the back half, which will help lock the silicone in the front half and make sure that when the mold's put together, it lines up correctly. I'm also going to put some big chunky keys on to make sure that the front and back halves of the fiberglass line up nicely. Okay, I'm going to use some wax on the back half here. I'm spraying with an aerosol can. I'm just spraying probably 2 or 3 layers of wax all over the plaster and over the clay wall, and I dry it with a hairdryer between layers to make sure that I build up a good 2 or 3 layers. And this wax layer will help release the fiberglass from the plaster, and it will also make sure that the moisture that's inside doesn't creep through to the polyester. You can spray sealers on here if you wanted to, but I didn't want to. If you want to spray a sealer, you can use like a clear lacquer or something like from a car, body spray shop just to seal that in. But I'm going to try and see if this works without it. I'm pretty sure it'll be fine, but if it doesn't work, then you can have a laugh. Now once my wax has dried, like I say, I did let it dry between each layer, or you can speed it up with a hairdryer. I'm just going to pump some talc over the back here. What this does is it stops the surface from being too slippery and too waxy, and it also helps me to see where I've gone with the gel coat. So I just give this a good sort of talc all over, and then brush off the excess to make sure there's no sort of collected pools of talc in the corners. Okay, it's time for the gel coat now. So I'm going to pour out what I estimate to be enough gel coat to do the back. And I'm going to put in some catalyst, and I'm going to mix up here a little bit of what's known as a hot mix by putting in a bit more catalyst than normal. And the reason I'm doing that is because the moisture in the plaster head and the clay, even though I've waxed it and dried it, it's still quite damp and quite cold inside under that wax, and that temperature can slow down the resin. So to compensate for that, I'm going to use a little bit more catalyst. I always mix it thoroughly. I like to use the brush if possible to mix the catalyst in, because it does a nice job of mixing it well. And I mix thoroughly for a good minute or so just to make sure that it's well mixed. Once that gel coat's mixed, we go on all over, making sure not to miss anywhere. So going right into the corners, make sure there's no air bubbles in the little key that goes around the outside edge, and go right to the edge of the wall. So there's a good even thickness over the entire surface, and down onto the moulding board too. So there's a nice sort of base to the bottom of the mould. It's always worth checking very carefully at the edges to see how your fiberglass is going. After about 10 or 15 minutes, this is starting to set up, and you can see when I move the gel coat gently with a tongue stick, you can see how the surface has kind of gone off, but it's slightly slimy underneath. And that, like I say, is because the underside is in contact with that damp clay, which is cooler than the outside. So we just need to kind of give that another minute or so to kind of firm up. Okay, so once I'm happy that the gel coat's set up properly, I'm going to throw some chopped strands, and very short chopped strand fiberglass fibers all over the back. And basically what these do, they get into all the nooks and crannies and all the detail, and they stick to the gel coat. It's very important to do this while the gel coat has set but is still sticky. If you were to leave it for a few more hours, you'd find that the gel coat would be not sticky anymore. But we want to try and catch it at this sticky stage. So I sprinkle the stuff all over. Because we're dealing with a vertical surface here, you have to kind of throw it at the surface and trying to scoop up what falls on the bench and put it back on there. But once you've got a nice even coat all over, it's time to start with the next layer of resin. So I measure out my resin, what I estimate to be enough resin, and this time I'm going to put a lot less catalyst in than last time, because whereas I needed the first coat to go on quite quickly and go off quite quickly, this I'm going to be layering up fiberglass in layers. I'm laminating now, so this is going to take longer, so I don't need it to go off as quickly. So I'm going to put in, like I say, less catalyst, and I mix it as before with the brush very, very thoroughly to make sure the whole thing's mixed in well. Once the resin's mixed up, I first need to wet down all my chopped strand that's stuck to the gel coat. So I just go around the whole thing and just brush on a layer of resin here, and this will help kind of fill in all the nooks and crannies and make sure that detail does get caught in the first layer of glass, because it's very easy to trap air bubbles. And obviously this is the first layer that's in contact with the gel coat, so I need to make sure that this is a very nice, good clean layer that's got everything. Once that's all wetted up, I can start wetting up my strips of fiberglass. Now I'm using a chopped strand mat, so this mat already comes with these sort of strands everywhere, and I cut it up into squares and into little rectangles too. And I like to go around the edge first. It's a habit I've developed. It just makes sense, because if for some reason the resin goes off or something happens, it's good if it goes off on the edges first and you've done the edges, because you can kind of trim the edges, which I'll show you in a second. So out of habit, I tend to do the edges first, and I go around the whole edge, overlapping each time with a new piece of glass. And I like to wet the glass out on a bench or something first before laying the glass on. Sometimes people like to put dry glass onto the mold and then wet it out in place, but I like to actually wet the glass out first and then lay it in place. And after a couple of minutes, it softens up and becomes very pliable, and is much more easily to sort of tap it around corners and get it to fit the contours of the shape. And you do that with the brush. You just pound it with a brush and gently brush them out until it takes on the shape of the mold underneath. So I'm going to do 2 layers over the whole thing with an extra one on the edge on the flange. So there's going to be 3 layers on the flange, which makes it a nice thick edge, because obviously that's where the bolts are going to go, and when you're opening the mold, it's the edge of the mold that gets, you know, levered against and pushed against, so that takes the most punishment. So it makes sense to make those a little bit thicker than the rest of the mold, and it also keeps it quite light. If we made the whole thing 3 layers, it would use more materials and it would weigh more, so the edges tend to be thicker and tougher than they need to be, just to make sure that the mold is going to last a long time. So once I've finished, after about 25 minutes or so of fiberglassing, the resin is starting to set up now. It's going kind of cheesy in texture. If you touch the fiberglass now, it's sort of stiff. It's not completely set, but it's getting there. And now is a good time to trim it. And I like to use a craft knife, just like a Stanley knife I've got here. And I'm going to trim this now, because if I can trim it now, it just saves me having to use power tools and make a lot of mess and dust later. Sometimes it's not possible to do this if a mold is very large. If you're doing like a whole body size mold, it isn't practical because you can't necessarily get around that mold in time. But for a small mold like this head, it makes sense, if possible, to trim it whilst it's still green. That's why this is known as green trimming, because the material hasn't quite set up yet. So about half an hour later, the resin is set up properly. It's still a little warm. The resin does get warm when it's gone off, but it has set. And this is a good time to remove the clay wall from the front now, because when it's slightly warm, what happens is it warms up the wax slightly, and it's possible to carefully peel away the clay wall now, so that you've got a very clean wall. You can use a little bit of water as well to help you, and it should, if you're lucky, you should be able, if you catch it right, you should be able to peel the clay almost cleanly away from the gel coat wall now, because this has had a good layer of wax and it should just peel away. If there's any kind of clay left over, being clay, it's very easy to just wash it off with a wet sponge or a brush and some water, just to kind of make it nice and clean. Okay, so that's the back half that's been fiberglassed, and in the next video I'll take you through how I did the front half, which is going to be a slightly different process because we need to make the front half in silicone as well as fiberglass. Okay, so that was part 1. If you have any questions about this or any other aspects of making prosthetics, please do feel free to ask questions. My email address is mail@learnprostheticmakeup.com, or you can just ask a question in the comments box below and I will get back to you as soon as I can. Thanks very much for watching.